Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's book, The Life of the Mind, her last unfinished book. We read part one on thinking, and now we are entering into part two, willing. We started last week. This is, we should say, I don't even know if I said it last time, whereas the part on thinking, had been edited by her and written and some drafts. The willing part, was more rough. And it had not been gone, whereas the thinking, she had taught a course on it and given the lectures. The willing chapters are newer and less, I think, polished. Nevertheless, as James just said in a short comment, there's some brilliant stuff, and you get to see Hannah Arendt reading philosophy and philosophers. As Taro and I were just talking a little bit ago, this is someone who was not a philosophy teacher, didn't think of herself as a philosopher, and to see the inspiration and erudition that she brings to the history of thought is extraordinary. So let's just make sure we're on board with what's going on in this chapter on willing, or this book on willing. So a quick review from what we did last week. The problem of the will, right, is the problem of freedom. That's the key. That's, you want to unlock Arendt's interest in the will. Why is she interested in this very esoteric thing called the will, which she says the Greeks didn't even understand or have a concept for? It's because willing is freedom. And the second part, the second thesis, is that it's because willing is freedom that philosophers have ignored willing, because they've ignored freedom. In fact, it's almost a professional liability of philosophers that they will be suspicious of the will and suspicious of freedom. Why? Well, because will is free. It's spontaneous. It's what she calls a spring of action. It is therefore often irrational, passionate. It bursts into the open. The will is thus not only associated with freedom, it's associated with politics. It's associated with all of what we do that is sort of untutored, uncontrolled, not subject to the highfalutin will of the philosophers. And so that's the interest in the will, is that the will is this faculty of the mind, right? Where The Life of the Mind is the title of the book. And we just spent a whole first part talking about thinking as life, thinking as the breath of life, thinking as what it is, that there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking is dangerous. It constantly destroys. And yet thinking is also that which brings us to be, and possibly, insofar as it constantly demands of us that we accord with who we are, that maybe it helps prevent evil. And then this brings up the last problem of freedom, which is freedom and the will are about evil, right? Insofar as freedom is based not in truth, but in simply having a will. The touchstone of a free act, she says as well, is that you could have left it undone, right? I said my arm can go up and down, or I can read Hannah Arendt. But as soon as I've done it, well, we understand that there's a lot of causes for it. It's caused by the fact that I founded the Hannah Arendt Center and we did this and we wanted to do this. And you can make these causal arguments, but true freedom means you could have done it differently. You didn't have to do it. It's lawless. There's no limits. And thus there's a kind of potential for evil in all freedom. And so these are the sort of overarching problems that this chapter or this book on freedom is about. Where we are today is we're starting this with part 4 of book 1 of freedom. Of willing, and it's called The Problem of the New. Those of you who've read some Hannah Arendt know that this goes by the name of natality. Arendt says on page 29 that the objections that the philosophers have are not against free will in the sense of the will to choose, right? The philosophers' antagonism to the will doesn't mean that I can't choose to read Hannah Arendt over Friedrich Nietzsche. I happen to like them both, but that's not what she's saying. So that's not what they're opposed to. They know we have that kind of freedom of will. What they're opposed to is the freedom of the will as the power, and it's important to hear the word power, the power of beginning something new. There's a kind of sense that the philosophers have that freedom is a delusion, that there's a necessity in the world, and that, while we may think we're free, and we may all feel the sense that we can stand up or sit down, or we can read Nietzsche, or we can read Hannah Arendt, it's actually the case that while we subjectively and consciously feel free, we are actually determined by a whole series of causes, whether it's religious, theological, or whether it's scientific or psychological. We actually are not free, and freedom is a delusion. It was Bergson who Arendt says was the first one to sort of turn this around and say, actually, it seems that necessity could be the delusion, and freedom actually what exists. Why should we assume that the world makes sense, that the world is rational? The foundation for that is, of course, someone like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who introduces into Western thinking the principio rationis, the principle of sufficient reason, which says that everything that is has a reason, which means that everything we do, whether it's standing up or sitting down or reading Hannah Arendt, has a reason, which means it's necessitated. And so Leibniz gets into all these fascinating debates around free will, in which he says, you seem to act free, you feel you act free, but you're actually necessitated. And this is the sort of argument that Arendt is contesting. She mentions here Duns Scotus, the Christian philosopher, who we'll read a lot more about later. And for her, Duns Scotus is one of the most interesting and important philosophers, because Duns Scotus makes the claim that against all other Christian philosophers, that God is willful, that what God does is contingent, that the world does not follow a reasonable, rational idea, and that the typical Christian idea is that God's will is rational, whereas human will is irrational. But Duns Scotus says no, God's will is just will; it's free. There's no rationality to it, and so for Arendt, this Duns Scotus thus is for her the philosopher who understands that will is freedom, that will is contingent, and that will is political. And he stands against the entire rest of the tradition of philosophy in the West that says that the will must be subjected to our reason. I'm going to enable transcription. Somebody asked for it, so I hope that's okay. The the point that we have, as I said, is that the will is political, and that it opposes the idea of a simplified, clear, contingent, and free rational thought. And so what Arendt says is, what we really see here is that the problem of the new, the fact that the will is new and free, has a power of freedom, is what the philosophers really are bothered by. And she says, why? And the answer is evil. This is on page 33 to 34, and where she says, the suspicion is strengthened when one considers how closely all free will theories are tied to the problem of evil. And that really is where is sort of the depth of the problem here. Chapter 5 is called The Clash Between Thinking and Willing, the Tonality of Mental Activities. And so here, again, this is her sort of ruminating on, okay, if there really is this antagonism between willing and thinking, and if the philosophers really do come down on the side of thinking over willing, why, right? And well, one is the problem of evil, but another, she says, is this tonality. All both thinking and willing are mental activities. They both make present what is absent. They thinking draws into its enduring present the past, whereas willing stretches the present into the future. But what the real point is here, she says, is when we look at willing and thinking, they affect our psychic apparatus or our soul. I think it was Tara who brought up, or someone brought up the soul last week. I forget who it was. And so here we do have her talking about the soul, our psychic apparatus that's equipped to deal with what comes toward it from the region of the unknown. This is on page 35. And the chief modes of the soul, she says, are hope and fear, the two things that were also in Pandora's box. And what the soul wants is hope and not being fearful. And that requires clarity and thinking. The soul wants the mind to grant clarity. And so she says we have an urge to fatalism. There's an existential advantage of fatalism. Even though we may know that fatalism is wrong, we are inclined toward it because it's soothing. It holds on to the idea of the quiet of the past, that it can't be undone. And so she says the predominant mode of thinking is serenity. Now, you have to remember that in part 1 on thinking, we hear a lot about the restlessness of thinking and the life, the thinking is like life and the breath. It hardly seems serene in part 1. And it's not. I mean, there's a way in which thinking can be disruptive, in fact, dangerous, as she says in part 1. And yet here, in the clash between thinking and willing, thinking assumes the tonality of quietism, of fatalism, of serenity, whereas willing is restless. I think we have to, I think this is a conflict, contradiction, inconsistency, a tension, I think is a better way to put it, in Arendt's work. I mean, as she will say at one point in The Human Condition, contradictions are sort of the important parts of any philosopher's thinking. If you find a contradiction in a great thinker, that doesn't mean the great thinker is contradicting themselves. It means that's a point of tension. And she's talking about Marx when she says that in The Human Condition. This may be one of those moments in this book and in these things. So the tonality of will is restlessness, whereas the tonality of thinking, she says, is serenity. She explains this at the end of the this chapter with 2 examples. one from Leibniz and one from Meister Eckhart, a Christian thinker. Leibniz at one point says that the sin of Judas was not betraying Jesus, but in his suicide. And what Leibniz means by that is that in his suicide, he suggests that he was free and had done evil, which means he denies the omnipotence and omniscient wisdom of God. And that's his sin. Similarly, Meister Eckhart says that if we sin 1,000 sins, we should not we should not will not to have committed them. In fact, we should will to commit them, because if we sin 1,000 sins, it must be God's plan. And thus, to think that we did it willfully is to deny the power of God and deny the goodness of God's world. And so this is the kind of quietism that she's now associating with thinking. One way to, I think, make sense of this tension between a quietist thinking here and more active thinking in the chapter on thinking is to recall that the thinking that she's talking about here is the thinking done by professional philosophers. It's not thinking as she understands it in book one, in the book on thinking. It's a particular kind of thinking, which is the conceptual effort of philosophers to impose order on the world and thus oppose freedom, will, politics, restlessness. And so that's, I think, a way to, I think that's, I hope the way, I believe the way to sort of resolve that tension, at least to the extent it can be resolved. In chapter 6 on Hegel's solution, the philosophy of history, well, Hegel's solution to what? To the problem of freedom, the philosophical problem of freedom, to the philosophical disdain for freedom. That's what this chapter is about, or this book. Remember, this book overall is called The Philosophers and the Will. It's not about thinking and will, it's about philosophical thinking and will. And Hegel's solution to it is the philosophy of history, namely that what happens in history is willful, right? Is a human will, is an actualization of human will, but it's an actualization of human will that is an unfolding of spirit or the intellect or being, and as such, the willful, political, seemingly disorderly happenings of the world are actually manifestations of the thought, of the rational thought, of being, of logic, if you want to go to the full Monty of Hegel. And so we have to take seriously that history yields truth, so that when we will the French Revolution and we create a great terror and we bring about a new form of government, that's not simply willfulness absent reason. It is the becoming actual of reason for Hegel. And this is this overall idea of the becoming actual of reason, that thought precedes reality, and that reality is a manifestation of thought, goes by the name in Hegel's work of reconciliation. So on page 46, where this sort of comes to a head, 46 to 47, Arendt says that, in thinking about the French Revolution, he never forgot that early experience. As late as 1829 and 30, he told his students, in such times of political turnabout, philosophy finds its place. This is when thought precedes and shapes reality. For when one form of the spirit no longer gives satisfaction, philosophy sharply takes note of it in order to understand the dissatisfaction. So at a time when people are dissatisfied, French Revolution, pre-revolutionary times, and the old order has broken down, she'll call these times later in her, or not later, but in some of her interviews around this period, revolutionary situations, right? In revolutionary situations, times in which the authority has broken down and the powers and institutions have broken down. And she says power is lying in the streets. Philosophy takes notes of it in order to understand the dissatisfaction. So if you read some of her interviews given in the 1960s about the 1960s activism and protests and revolutionary elan of the time, what she'll say is we were in a revolutionary situation. And the mistake that the revolutionaries made is that they didn't think enough. That's a strange claim that she makes in those texts. But what she says is they simply embraced tired old cliches of Marxism and communism, which had already shown themselves in her mind, and she says in the minds of most people, not to work. And these revolutionaries sort of brought back these cliches, and they didn't work, and the revolution went nowhere, even though there was a possibility for it because there was a revolutionary situation. And she says what they didn't do is they didn't think. They didn't, what does that mean? Well, they didn't think through what, in the current situation, what could inspire people? What would be the new reality? And they just kept recycling old utopias that don't work. This is Hegel, right? When Hegel says, when one form of spirit no longer gives satisfaction, philosophy sharply takes note of it in order to understand the dissatisfaction. What he's saying is it's the philosophers who, at a revolutionary situation, have to think it through and bring about new ideas, new concepts. And so she says a little below this, in the French Revolution, principles and thoughts had been realized. A reconciliation had occurred between the divine, with which man spends his time while thinking, and the secular, the affairs of men. In order to bring about a revolution, you have to first think revolutionary thoughts. You have to think what the goal of the revolution is that will actually appeal to the people. And then you have to actualize it. And that's the historical reconciliation. So she'll continue. This reconciliation is the center of the whole Hegelian system. And her point here is that this reconciliation of thought and event is what gives human affairs meaning. It connects the spirit to the world and the world to the spirit. As she'll say on page 47, quoting Hegel, the insight then to which philosophy is to lead us is that the real world is as it ought to be. So whatever happens in the world is simply a manifestation of what ought. This is the conservative Hegel, right? That people don't like, that radicals or revolutionaries don't like because he justifies whatever is. But the radical Hegel is that we philosophers can think and in thinking give form to a new reality. And of course, you all know who the radical Hegelians are. They're Marxists. That's the Marx that comes out of Hegel. For Arendt, both Marx and Hegel are committed to the reconciliation of the world with spirit. that the world is to become a manifestation of the truth. And at the bottom of page 47, you see Arendt's answer to Hegel and ultimately to Marx, which is, quote, at the bottom of 47, Hegel's ultimate failure to reconcile the two mental activities, thinking and willing, with their opposing time concepts seems to me evident, but he himself would have disagreed, right? This is her response to Hegel and also to Marx, which is that the effort to reconcile is an ought, to make the world rational and to make the rational real, is for her actually not only a complete failure, doesn't work, it's where the danger of ideological totalitarian movements come in. That is, and so much, a lot of her critique and her writing about totalitarianism is a critique of the Hegelian and Marxian effort to reconcile the world with thinking, or the world with spirit, or the world with intellect. And that's where a lot of her, and so she says in her work, we need to learn to love the world, amor mundi. We need to reconcile with the world, but we also have to, at some points, come to terms with and reconcile with the fact that our world is not reconcilable, that our world is not rational. And this is where Arendt splits from progressives or progressivism. And then you'll see this on page 49 to 50, where she has this nice little chart that she builds for you. And she does it in such a way that even though thesis, antithesis, synthesis, thesis, antithesis goes back and forth, what she says is, if you look at the chart, it goes upwards in a progressive direction. And so she says, when applied to that this thesis, this dialectic, right, when applied to modern notions of progress, leads to a guarantee of what she calls infinite progress, a line of progress. It assures progress, she says on page 50. And this is, again, what worries her. Nietzsche, writing about this with Hegel in mind, famously said that left to itself, man's will would rather will nothingness than not will, right? This is Nietzsche's claim of nihilism. We would rather will nothingness than not will. We have to will. And in having to will, we have to annihilate what is and create infinite progress. And that, she says, the assumption behind this for Hegel and Marx and all rational progressive thinkers is that that the beginning point and the end point are rational, and that we're simply unfolding a rational world. And thus, if we do that, we justify the will, and we make will rational, and we justify the annihilating activity of the will, the nihilist evil that the will brings, because the will is going to, in the end, lead us to the promised land. And so all theories of means justified by the ends, right, are historical, are Hegelian in their foundations, right? That's the argument being made here, that Hegel and Marx bring a spiritualized, rationalized vision of history that can be reconciled and actualized in the world, and that therefore the will / evil / freedom can be justified. Now remember, Arendt also wants to redeem the will and redeem freedom, right? And redeem politics. But what she doesn't want to do is redeem them by saying they're simply rational, because that suggests that there's no that there's only one will, there's only one true politics, there's only one true freedom. And she doesn't think so. Freedom for her is the clash of opinions of politics. And that's where she parts ways with the philosophers of the will, right? So remember, this chapter is about the philosophers of the will. And it takes us up really from Aristotle all the way through Plato and Aristotle through Hegel, who she sees as the greatest philosopher of the will. And that's where it ends. And for next week, we go on to a different history, a different history of the will, which is the discovery of an internal will, not a worldly will. And that will be part 2, the discovery of the inner man. All right, I'll stop there. There are 2 different ways to contribute here. You can talk in the chat. I see it's already quite active. Wow, a lot of chats today. I hope you're enjoying it. Please be respectful. You can also go down to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, click on that and click on raise hand. Your hand will be raised and I'll call on people in the order that they make themselves known. If you have a quick comment that you want to make to someone else's comment, feel free to let me know. All right. Up first is Stephen.
Hi, Roger. Thanks very much. You've already answered one of my questions, which was going to be about the apparent or real tension between the restlessness of thinking and the nature of willing. That was very helpful. My question is about partly what you just said. After having dismissed Hegel and Marx, is there any serious or legitimate philosophy of history possible for Arendt? Or do we just give up on that kind of project because it's foredoomed and we shouldn't be looking for any large meaning, but maybe be content with what individualized meanings of our own lives or something like that? Is the philosophy of history project over as far as Arendt is concerned? I note that there is still action in that area on the part of some philosophers. I'm even a subscriber to the Journal of the Philosophy of History. So I'm wondering just whether the folks who are pursuing this now are beating the proverbial dead horse.
Right. Well, so, for better or worse, Arendt has no power to destroy the philosophy of history. And let me add that Arendt is hardly a non-historical philosopher. I mean, to read Arendt is to be confronted with history on a regular basis. If you want to look for what Arendt's philosophy of history would be, read Arendt or read Walter Benjamin, right? We've talked a little bit about Benjamin, but Benjamin's idea of pearl diving, right? Or you go back into history to pull out pearls and shine them up and give them a kind of find what's rich and strange in the past, to quote Shakespeare, right? And make it meaningful as a way of remembering and holding on to a meaningful tradition that is also at the same time broken. So, those approaches. So I think we read about this in the gap between past and future chapter here in this book. But if you read her essay on Walter Benjamin in Men in Dark Times, we talked a lot about it then too. That's her approach. Again, just like I said, she's not against politics clearly, and she's not against freedom, and she's not against will. She's against the rationality and the need to subordinate those to one thought, one reason. With history, she's certainly not against philosophically engaging with history, but she is against and warns against trying to impose uh, a single historical rationalist narrative. So yeah, I would look, they're not the only ones, but Arendt and Benjamin, I think, are in many ways the grounders of, or the founders of, another way of doing history. You can read Nietzsche that way too in some of his work. You can read Heidegger and even certain traditions out of the French tradition, Foucault and Derrida, in that tradition as well. There's other people doing this.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah.
James. James, James, you're muted. There's going to come a time when we're not going to be doing this all the time, and I don't have to say you're muted every 5 minutes, but James, you still have to unmute yourself. All right. Okay. There he is.
Are you there?
I am.
Okay. On the bottom of 47, speculative thought is precisely the unity of thought and time. It does not deal with being, but with becoming. And the object of the thinking mind is not being, but an intuited becoming. Could you expand on that? And I'm also interested in this idea of world spirit embodied in mankind. And why does she pick the spiral? Too many questions?
Where's the spiral? I don't know.
Page 48. Such a movement in which cyclical and rectilinear notions of time are reconciled or united by forming a spiral.
Okay. All right. So the first part on bottom of 47 is where I was saying she talks about Hegel's failure, right? Hegel's ultimate failure to reconcile the two mental activities, thinking and willing, seems to me evident, but he himself would have disagreed. Speculative thought is precisely the unity of thought and time. It does not deal with being, but with becoming. And the object of the thinking mind is not being, but an intuited becoming. The only motion that can be intuited is a movement that swings in a circle, forming a cycle that returns into itself, that presupposes its beginning and reaching beginning and end. Hegel finds the solution to this problem, how to transform the circles into progressing line, by assuming that something exists behind all the individual members of human species, and that something is mankind, is actually a kind of somebody that he calls the world spirit. To him, no mere thought thing, but a presence embodied in mankind. All right. I mean, as I said earlier, Hegel, right, seeks to demand that, not demand, have faith, believe, argue that the world is a reconciliation with thought. To do that, he has to presume that behind every individual man or person, there is a mankind. This is another, if you've read Rousseau, right? All of us have our individual will, but we also have participate in a general will. If you've read Kant, we're all, individual beings, but we also are universal rational beings. All of these rationalist thinkers have to, in some way, suppose something in us that allows us to overcome our subjective personal wills, desires, wants, and subordinate them to rational, worldly, spiritual events. Speculative thought is Hegel's name for that. It's thought that speculates that we are part of this unity. It's about becoming, in the sense that we're always in the process of becoming, but it's going to presuppose some world spirit and thus some being behind the becoming. I mean, this is her. I mean, she's, I think, a very, I mean, Hegel is maybe the most difficult thinker to read, largely because he constantly is contradicting himself on purpose. It's part of his thing that everything goes from thesis to antithesis and then back to a synthesis. And so one of the problems with reading Hegel and reading interpretations of Hegel is you can find quotes to support everything because he says the opposite, because that's how his philosophy works, by constantly moving. And so, what Arendt here is doing is simply, to some degree, showing that. The engine of his philosophy is negation, as he says at one point, which is not being, but becoming. But underlying that is a kind of world spirit or being. Yeah, I'm not sure how much I should go into Hegel. I'm not sure how much I can at this point. There was a time in my life when I was deeply, deeply enmeshed in this stuff, believe it or not. I spent 2 or 3 years doing nothing but reading Hegel. But it's been a long time.
Thank you, Roger.
Is there more? I mean, I don't know if you're interested in the Hegel question or what is it you're interested in, James?
I'm just looking for a path in the woods, and you gave it to me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Happy to be a pathfinder. Susan.
So I'm the one who keeps bringing up soul and Arendt.
Yes, I knew it was you. I thought of it then afterwards. Okay.
Apparent dismissal of it. But now I'm wondering, you seem to be using the word spirit to as thinking. So I'm wondering how you're using that word and what you mean by it, because that is really another layer of confusion.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So that's a Hegelian issue. So the word is Geist, Geist. It's a German word. What does it mean? But you all heard of spirit, Geister, ghosts, right? Ghosts, Geist. It's the word for ghost. It's typically translated as spirit. But it means much more than that. So what we call the humanities in English is the Geisteswissenschaften in German, the science of the spirit or the science of the intellect. Geist is that which is not material, and thus it is the intellectual or the rational. And so for Hegel, when we say the unification, the reconciliation of the world with mind, it's the world with Geist. That's the word he's using. And it can be a little confusing. Okay. Does that help? Ahmed.
Yeah. Hi, Roger. My question is about, I guess, what you think Arendt would say about the, the end of history thesis. But then, there's a new book that just came out, The End of History, which is trying to interpret sort of what is usually interpreted by sort of the intellectual class as the craziness of politics since 2016, within the framework of sort of Fukuyama's previous thesis. So I guess we can guess that, any kind of Hegelian end of history stuff would not be, that Arendt would not find that at all compelling. But I wonder what she would think about this end of history. How would she interpret yeah, after the fall of the Eastern Bloc and sort of the there's no longer an alternative to this kind of liberal representative government, that all there's left to do is just to manage capitalism, and there's really no alternatives. All parties are kind of doing the same thing. They're just kind of competing to be better managers of the status quo. And so that the reaction to that is, what's perceived as, radical, and sometimes is radical, Trump, Brexit, etc. Yeah, I wonder what you think she would say about that, and whether you would have further thoughts on that.
So, being asked to comment on two books I haven't read, one Fukuyama's and the other this new one, but into the void, as they say. You're right, obviously, that she wouldn't think much of the end of history thesis. As for the end of history thesis, I think, again, the basic idea, right, which is that we don't have there is not right now a common world, and there is not right now a tradition that is authoritative, and that authority is dead, I think is right. Within that, there's different ways to read it. One is that amidst the breakdown of cultures and traditions and the rise of what you'll call mass loneliness, we are ever more susceptible to movements and identity movements, and whether they're race-based or class-based or based in something else. At the same time, all efforts to impose a kind of technocratic, rationalist solution are going to lead to resentment and rebellion. So, is there a middle ground, or is there another path between sort of, technocratic rationalism is the modern response to the end of history, to the end of history. Once we are back to chaos, right, and the end of history, the response of 21st century politics is still being scared of politics. Put it in the hand of experts. Let experts rule. Let experts decide. That's not going to work, and it's not working, and we're seeing that right now. The other side, identitarian, totalitarian movements is also not exactly a good idea. So what's the alternatives, right? The alternative for Arendt is something which you'll call politics, learning to think without banisters, learning to be at home amidst real plurality and real disagreement, coming to see disagreement not as a bad thing, but as a good thing, and then talking to each other and finding the lowest common denominators that we do agree on, upon which we can build new common assumptions and new common worlds. I think that's the politics that Arendt offers us for the present, as I understand her. It's one that's not appealing to conservatives because it's radically open, and it's not appealing to liberals because it's not progressive, and it's incredibly humble in allowing different people to live differently, even with their prejudices and differences. And it's one of the reasons why it's not a very popular political position. But I take that to be her position. Is that, I'm
Yeah,
not, you know,
th-
I haven't read these two books, so I don't want to like get too deeply into them, but if I hope that was somewhat helpful on that.
yes, it was. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Bob. Bob, are you next or not?
Yeah, I had trouble unmuting. When I was in graduate school in history, we were fascinated by the idea of historical necessity versus historical determinism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still fascinated by that. I'm more interested in the historical necessity part of it. But I'm assuming that Hannah Arendt, while dismissing the determinism, would still champion necessity. And is that the case? Can you dig into that a little for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I'd like to hear from you a little bit more how you explain or understand the difference. My inclination is to say that Arendt is going to be suspicious that necessity doesn't bleed into determinism. But I guess one way to put it, and then I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it, is that she doesn't think Hegel is a determinist, right? I mean, there's nothing determinate in Hegel, but what there is laws of reason that we have to understand and apply. And when we do, we bring out, we bring these laws of freedom to be in the world. It's not that you could have written them in advance, but they, in a sense, appear and become what they are as an unfolding that we participate in. That's why I think Hegel is someone who's a historical necessity, is about historical necessity, not determinism per se. Although, again, I think she's suspicious of that distinction, but maybe I'm misunderstanding that distinction as you want to understand it.
Well, I guess when we were exploring historical necessity, it wasn't in order to prove or express the idea of freedom, although Crochet, I think, said something like history is the idea of freedom or vice versa. But it was more to explain that, you know, the past is a confluence of individual purposes and unexpected events and trends. And so the idea of necessity is, like you were discussing earlier, to come to terms with the past, to not to pretend, and this is maybe where Arendt would disagree, not to pretend that it could have been otherwise, because it's more important to understand how it was. And yet, you know, this bleeds into the issue of determinism, which again, in Arendt's conception, she rejects because of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have issues with that. I mean, I guess what you describe as Crochet is to me very much in line with Hegel, but maybe I'm misunderstanding it. History as the instantiation of freedom. Is there, I mean, is what I'm describing not what you mean by historical necessity?
No, you're just using a different language or different terms.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of it is I don't know. I don't have a strong need or understanding of why I would make that. I mean, yes, determinism is something different, right? Historical determinism is, or at least you could imagine it in a strong sense. God has a very particular plan and we're going from A to B and there's no freedom in between. That's not how any of these philosophers really think. It's not how Leibniz thinks. It's not how Hegel thinks. It's not how Marx thinks. There's part of God's plan for these thinkers is that man is free and that it depends upon man's freedom to actualize the plan. And therefore, there's all sorts of different ways it can go. But overall, where it's going is a place that God meant it to go, or reason meant it to go. It follows general laws, right? Now, each man may follow their own will and their own laws, and they're not always going to follow the general laws 100%. But as an aggregate, we will. That's sort of the scientific aspect of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, this is, like I said, we're getting into some philosophical parts that are sometimes, not so clear in my views. Neil. Neil. Neil?
Yes.
There you are.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about Hegel, because I read Karl Popper. I saw that you have, I see that you have Popper's book on the Open Society next to you. I read that last year and I wondered, is there someplace I could go where Arendt has written about Popper, or Popper has written about Arendt?
No.
Okay.
No. It's a nice question. We actually sponsored a week-long seminar on the Open Society and its enemies over the summer, which is why it's here. And we had a couple people putting Arendt and Popper into conversation. But one of the things that we looked for and we found out is that they never really encountered or discussed each other.
Okay.
And while there are some overlaps, and there's a way in which Popper's critique of historicism, which is at the ground of this book, is somewhat similar to Arendt's critique of historicism. And just like Arendt says that Plato was the great anti-political thinker who set the West on its way, Popper is going to say that Plato was the great historicist thinker who set the West on its way to avoid open society and avoid politics. And yet they have very different, what they do with that and their readings of Plato's are actually incredibly different. But there's enough overlap, and they're both obviously writing against totalitarianism, that it's worth trying to think them through in some way together. But their basic approaches are so fundamentally different in their just style and things, and they never, as far as I can tell, never really encountered each other, which seems shocking, but seems to be the case.
Okay, yeah, because her view, his view of Hegel is so different too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was struck by the whole thing after reading The Origins of Totalitarianism to read The Open Society and Its Enemies. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Susan Wright.
Yeah. Hi, Roger. So this question is probably going to make you a little crazy because it's quite philosophical, but it's this whole, but it's been discussed in the chapters on time. Yeah, past, present, and future. So if willing, let's say the function of willing, if willing pulls us into the future, which is the way I'm reading it, the way I understand that it's being written, willing pulls us into the future, then this idea of history and all this discussion of history, is there any place in our capacity to will for history? And if this is the second part that's going to make you crazy, and if there's past, present, and future, but of course the present is always now. Yeah. So you've got this continuum. I mean, the past is like a second ago now. Yeah. So I'm combining a couple things, perhaps more about willing, since this is what we're really talking about, perhaps more the concept of willing as it crosses these time boundaries or barriers, because it never stops.
Mhm.
An obvious statement, and yet, do you see where I'm just trying to wrangle with this a little bit?
Maybe.
Or am I reading? Maybe I'm reading too much into the time scale. Maybe the willing is strictly the future, the way we think about it in a man-made construct.
Well, I mean, the first part of your question, right, which is that how do you will the past? That's a problem because you can't really change the past.
You can't.
Now, there are different solutions that people have to that. One is Nietzsche's solution, which is that since you can't change the past and your will demands you to be able to change the past, the only way to do that is to will the eternal return of the same, so that you make the past that which you had willed, right? That's one response. Another is you have some of these sort of creative ideas in which, well, if you go back and rewrite the past, re-narrate the past, you can change the present and the future. And so there are ways to imagine that you can will the past by, changing the facts through propaganda or just re-narration. I mean, look what's going on in this country right now with our attempt to re-narrate our past around slavery or race. There's a lot of different techniques. Take down things, sculptures, right? Put up new sculptures, put up plaques to reimagine the history. And all of this is an attempt to master the past. And so, we say you can't change the past, and yet to some degree we can. Not by changing what happened, but by changing which parts of the past we attend to.
But then if we do that, then what we will is based on what we will for the future becomes based on not the truth. It's based on propaganda.
Well, I mean, it's not always, well, maybe propaganda is the wrong word. You always only can know a tiny sliver of the history, right? I mean, no one knows the whole history. So it's just a matter of which parts of that history you're going to teach people. And if you focus on, all white men, that's one part of history. But if you go to that and say, we're going to also focus on what, non-white men did, and that means we're going to give less place and time to white men, that's going to change history and it's going to change the future. Is that propaganda? No, I don't think so. It's, but it is a willful history.
It's a selective history. It's selective.
So
Yes.
the answer,
Yes.
the response to that is all history.
Yes.
All history is selective history.
Yes. Well, of course.
Right. I mean, there's no single, master narrative, to use a provocative locution.
Roger, let me
Yeah.
suggest is I think it's very careful in our discussion and what you're talking about here with Susan to distinguish the past and history. History is always in the present. It is the choices we make to investigate the past. Think of the past as a block of granite and histories as the statues that we carve out of that granite. So the two vary. One is the past fixed, one is the present malleable.
That's
Yeah.
a great, it's a nice
That's
point.
good.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
good. That's good. Thank you. That's
Thanks.
quite good.
Thanks, Steve.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yep. Ken. Yeah.
Thanks, Roger. Well, I have so many thoughts and questions, but when we're talking about willing history and willing the past, I think it gets confusing because from my reading, that's thinking. That's not willing for her. The willing has to do with the future. So the past may have been created by willing, but when we're talking about revising history, I think we're talking about thinking and probably judging as far as my understanding of this book goes. And the way the conversation is going, I'm thinking a lot about my understanding of her differences with Hegel and also with Benjamin have to do not with their view of history, but with their view of the future. And I think maybe it's in On Revolution or maybe on Violence, where she says something about Hegel's view of the world spirit is brilliant and intolerable. It's one of the most intolerable theories philosophically that she could think of. I think it's On Revolution. Do you remember that? But
Yeah, I think that's his idea that the world is justified. Yeah.
yeah,
But-
and it seems like that coincides with what you were saying before, which I appreciated about where it sounds like it starts to come into like his world spirit starts to sound a little too much like Aryan supremacy or the march of the proletariat or something like that. It sounded too much like Stalinism or Nazism to her. And that seems like, so what I'm saying, or my understanding, is that her conflict with Hegel and the reason he's in this part of the book isn't because of history. I think she admires very much how he brings history into philosophy, but how he limits the possibilities of future. Like there's no possibility she's always trying to preserve freedom and newness. And if there's a world spirit that we're all following, if we're all marching towards this world spirit, then that's all gone. And my understanding of this whole chapter is it's about talking about the will, embracing Hegel to a degree, but then when he starts limiting freedom, I think that's where it seems to me she has a real difference with him, his writing.
Yeah. I mean, she starts off the chapter on Hegel saying, he's a great thinker of the future. And then she says, but no, he's the great thinker of the past. And they're both true. This is what I said before, part of the problem of reading Hegel. It's, you can't just pick out parts and say, oh, he's this or he's that. You have to sort of read the whole thing and integrate it into your thought. She's making the argument that he's ultimately a thinker of the future. And that's the thinker of will, which is why she's talking about him here.
But does it become intolerable where it starts to limit freedom? Does he just take his view of the future too far?
No, when she says that it's intolerable, she's talking about a very famous line in Hegel where he says, das Weltgericht ist die Weltgeschichte, I think. The world court is the world history, or is it the other way? The world history is the world court. And basically what he's saying there is that what happens in history is the court of justice. It's just. There's nothing that can happen that in the end is unjust. And that's what she says is intolerable. I mean, that's the part of Hegel that all progressive, liberal, young Hegelians at all times have found intolerable, right? It's the full justification of what is by as what ought to be.
I thought it was that I thought she said his fundamental mistake is that he looked at history and then he thought, since it seems inevitable because it exists, for her, it's all contingent. Everything could happen differently. But for him, because and people, when we look back, history, it's hard to imagine it being different, that his mistake was then he projected that into the future and made it seem like a march. And anytime it seems like a march, it sounds dangerous.
Okay, he did that too. Yeah, he did that too. But I'm not sure. But that's not what's intolerable. What's intolerable is the idea that I believe is that the world court is world history.
But I think she is trying to find a way to deal with the future. I think that chapter that we read here, and also the introduction to past and future, where she chooses the Kafka story, and it seems like that choice of the Kafka story is in contrast to the angel of history. And her difference with Benjamin seems to me like that he's almost looking back too much, and he somehow needs to turn to the present, or she needs to turn to the present and somehow hopefully affect the future with her thinking. That seemed to me like the difference between why she wouldn't choose the angel of history story and she chose the Kafka story instead.
Yeah,
which seems like what's being wrestled with in the will also.
Yeah, well, as I said before, there's a version of this which is that we have a progressive history. There's a conservative version, and then there are attempts to deal with the brokenness of our world and the loss of authority and the broken pillars of tradition. Benjamin's is largely a backward-looking approach. Arendt's is a approach that looks back through history and pearl diving, but with an eye towards reconciling ourselves to the irreconcilability of the world today and embracing what is the present. I think hers is a much more presentist view than that's why it's between past and future. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Rob.
Thanks. I'm just reading from the top of page 37. Just want a clarification on the section. Second sentence says, every volition that only concerns particulars, but, and this is of great importance, looks forward to its own end. When willing something, will have changed into doing it. In other words, the normal mood of the willing ego is impatience, disquiet, and worry, sarga. Not merely because the soul is reacting to the future in fear and hope, but also because the will's project presupposes an I can that is by no means guaranteed. So I guess what I'm thinking is, what does it mean for the willing to want its own end? And what does it mean for its end? I mean, in one case, thinking, the kind of making thinking superior to willing is sort of the end of willing, because you just say you kind of figured it out. Hegel says, so the truth is history. We can understand it through thinking. And in that sense, it kind of quiets the worry. But if we don't use thinking and we just let willing do its thing, then that kind of assumes that we're always going to be in a world of worry. And my question, I guess, following that is, how does Arendt reconcile loving the world when it's unreconcilable? It's full of worry.
So the first part of your question, on 37 is simply a technical explanation of the sentence before the one you read. Right? So she says, every volition, although a mental activity, relates to the world of appearances in which its project is to be realized, in flagrant contrast to thinking, no willing is ever done for its own sake. No willing is ever done for its own sake. Willing is done for the sake of something in the future. So that's where she says every volition is not only concerns particulars, but has an end, looks forward to its own end when willing something will change. doing it. I do this in my class with my students when I teach this. I call on somebody and I say, will to come up to the board and write the word will. And they go, okay. And I said, no, will to go up to the board and write the word will. And they say, okay. And I say, no. And until I keep doing it until they get up and try and come to the board and write the word will, at which point I can't do this as much as you used to because of all these things, but I used to tackle them and say, and then I would, talk about you have to keep willing, right? But the point is for her, will is something that includes doing. And it's not just an abstract thing. You will to do something. The will always wills to do something. It's not just thinking. Now there was a second part of your question, which I was going to answer and I just blanked on it. What was the last thing you said?
Is, I guess, the second part of the quote that I read, that the willing ego is impatient, disquiet, and worry. And if the world, if you don't end the will, then you're kind of suspended into a state of worry in the world. And thinking about Arendt's idea of amor mundi, to love the world, I feel like there's a contradiction of being in a world of, maybe this is just my limited perspective of the world, but for me to be in a world full of worry is a contradiction of loving the world.
Yeah, well, that's where I think you've got to grow into Arendt. She is arguing we have to love a worry-filled world, and a world that doesn't have truth and that is full of evil. Evil is part of the human world.
Roger, can I jump in here really quickly? I was glad that Rob brought up this passage, because this to me was, one of her moments of distinction that was so productive for me. And I feel like her emphasis on the anxiety and the worry is about the responsibility to act. So it's not just as much about, it's kind of willing and looking towards the future and knowing, in fact, that one may need to act. But it is the sense of being oriented towards the future, which first of all interrupts thinking, right? Which is past oriented, every thought is an afterthought, which is sort of anxiety provoking in itself. But then it's also the responsibility, once one starts willing, that one may choose, in fact, not to act. And I think that is this idea of the mood of anxiety that comes with the I can that is not just, it may not go as I thought, but it's an I can that I may not even attempt. And how do you live with the after effect of having willed but not done?
But sorry, Tara. Before you jumped in, Professor Roger was trying to elaborate something, and I was like engaged in what he was elaborating because it was quite interesting. If you can,
but it was similar to what Tara's saying. So let's
continue.
Let's keep going with what Tara's saying. So Tara, what do you want to finish up your thought?
No, I think that's fine. I think I got it.
Okay.
Well, can you, both of you, can you like make a note of it? I mean, like something, final assumption or something like that?
I don't think that Arendt's concern with anxiety, again, to me, it is important to always be thinking about that in her statement that the will is something to do with evil and something to do with acting. And that the question of willing will be, to me, for her, both the question of doing something and not doing something. That if one is oriented towards the future, one has a responsibility to the future. And that the anxiety of willing is both the imagining an action in the future, and then also not taking that action out of fear, out of lack of courage, out of the unwillingness to confront uncertainty.
But it's possible to have a responsibility to the future. I don't know.
Tara?
I think that Arendt is saying, yes, we do have a responsibility to the future.
Yes, I don't agree, but let's go on.
Yeah, okay.
I have a thought on this point, if I might jump in quickly.
Yeah.
Sort of tying together a couple of different points that have been made over the course of today, thinking about the temporality of willing, and thinking back to what we were saying about Hegel. To me, what this is, the larger point of this section is sort of getting at is, so if willing is our action and our lack of action, as Tara said, sort of our participation in the world, and it is therefore future oriented in a way that we act to change and to create the future that exists, perhaps we can look to the past as the collective choices and willing and actions of everyone collectively in the past, and we can look to it for patterns and to understand how we can affect the future, how we can create a different world, how we can change things. But I think the problem that Arendt has with Hegel is perhaps the determinism, that if we see these patterns in the past, they must therefore be oriented to the future. And I think what she is arguing for is a way of thinking about willing in a way that we recognize that there are these patterns that exist in society, that people make these choices over and over again, that these things repeat themselves. And so how do we create a different world? How do we move forward? How do we do actions in the present that are going to establish a sort of different possibility for the future? And so this anxiety about what the future could be or is or should be, and this anxiety about what do I do and how do I change things, is all part of the act of willing. But it ultimately, willing is the actions and the behaviors and everything that creates the future, through our collective willing in the present.
Thanks. Thank you. Bob, did you want to have your hand up again, or is that from before?
Oh, it's again. Rob's reference to the passage at the top of page 37, where Arendt claims no willing is ever done for its own sake. I'd like to challenge that. I know I've willed just to see, hey, let's see what happens when I do this or do that. And, I think that's pretty common.
Yeah. I mean, you mean like I will to raise my hand?
No, I mean something a little more significant like that. Maybe goad Roger Berkowitz.
Oh, you've never done that, Bob. I can tell you that. Okay, but why would that be for its own sake? I mean, I assume you're doing it, for some deep pleasure that it gives you.
Well, it doesn't have an end. It's just, let's see what happens. Let's try it and see where it goes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a, I'm not sure how important it is to Arendt's thinking. You know, this is a claim that's made by a number of philosophers, including Kant. You know, if you read Kant's Second Critique, he makes this point, right? And it's a very important point within the Second Critique, that will is always, that will is not just an abstract will. It has to be a will to actually do something. So yeah, I mean, you can, you know, if I say will to go to the board or will to goad Roger, you know, it doesn't have to have a deep meaning to it. But the point is, if you will for it, you actually try and do it. You try and accomplish it. It's not just like I sit there and say, I'm going to will. If you will to goad Roger Burgess, you actually have to raise your hand and ask him a question he can't answer, or that it's going to piss him off, because, you know, otherwise if you're just willing it in your head, but not trying to do it, you're not actually willing it. You're just maybe contemplating it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does, but I don't want to give up my position.
Now you're goading me.
You know, okay, so when I was in high school, I played on the baseball team. I didn't have to. And, you know, I was thinking, well, let's see what I can do. Or, you know, if you have a boat, or I have a jet ski, I'm a lowlife. You know, if I get out there on the lake and nobody's around, you know, I will to speed.
But I think she's saying something much more basic here, Bob, which is, if you will to jet ski, you actually have to try and go get on a jet ski and go jet ski. Now, if you don't have a jet ski, you know, you got to, you know, and you will to jet ski, then you got to figure out how to buy one or acquire one or steal one. But the point is, willing is not just contemplating, it's an actual active attempt to do. That's, I think, the point she's making. It's, and I'm not sure how important it is for any of us, but you know,
now you're goading me.
Well, it's important in Kant, because Kant wants to say that if you have a good will, you actually have to try and actualize it, but human beings are not always capable of doing it. And therefore we fall short, but we still have to try. And so it's part of his moral philosophy. And so he makes this claim. I think that's where she's taking this from. I honestly don't know. But yeah, but I mean, you know, she's not talking about the choice between different things, playing baseball or going jet skiing. That's a different idea of willing that she's not talking about here. She's talking here about willing as the power to start something new. And so if you will to do something, you actually have to not only mentally will it, but you actually, if you will it, you actually got to try and do it, unless you're incapable of it.
Well, I guess the point I want to make is willing is not necessarily tied to a goal or an end. Could be its own end.
Yeah, will. Can you will to will? Or do you have to will something? I think you have to will something, but we'll get there a little later in the book.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're out of time, Jeff and Anthony. I'm sorry. Is that all right? Or is there something quick that you have? All right. We will continue next week. Enjoy reading. Or no, we're not meeting next week, right?
I think the next is the 19th of November, isn't that right?
Oh, that's a good point. We're gonna, Tara, do you want to say something about the 12th? Aren't you doing a review on the 12th?
Yeah, Roger invited me to just do a kind of catch-up overview session, and I would love for this to be a place for maybe a more back and forth conversation where there's maybe less of a kind of overview or intro and more of a space for a conversation to continue or to pick up threads that did not get the full time. So I hope that people can show up and bring questions or topics from the book up to this point, and also turn to each other for some input and conversation.
Oh, nice.
So,
Thank you.
So,
yeah.
Tara is,
What do you
oh,
think,
I'm sorry, Roger, go ahead.
I'm just saying, I have to be, I'm traveling the next 2 weeks. But Tara, next week we're not meeting, but the 12th we will meet, and Tara will lead a general discussion, sort of, are there confusions, catch up, talk about it, things like that. And I think it'll be great. And then we'll resume on the 19th,
Yeah.
The 19th.
19th. Yeah. And
Nice.
so
Tara sounds great. Thank you.
Tara, is that the same link and everything, or you'll send out something separate?
it'll be the same link.
It's the same thing. Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Tara will see you on the 12th, and I'll see you on the 19th. Thanks very
Have a good
much.
trip.